All right, thank you so much. I'm Frank, Josh, and for those of you that came in, drove in the weather, thank you for being here. I think this is a fantastic event, and thank you so much for the invitation. When Ed first invited us, he says, Frank, you guys have to come up with a really, really exciting, sexy topic. So we thought, what a better answer to that than cybersecurity and cyber insurance, of course, for the IoT audience. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time on securing devices. By the way, that was an excellent introduction. It's just how to stay off the news. That preventative side of our business is a massive, massive focus. But then also how to protect yourself on the back end. So if something does happen, what is the right coverage? What is the right insurance? How to marry those two worlds? And maybe that's the best way to introduce Blowing Security. Josh and I have spent about 4 years together now at our previous company. And so when we started Blowing Security, we saw this tremendous opportunity between the world of cybersecurity and the world of cyber insurance, and the disconnect that existed between those two worlds, right? Both of which are trying to manage risk, business risk, exposure risk, reputational risk, risk of a breach and an attack. But yet they were both going about it very differently, and we thought we had a perfect marriage of those two worlds in our experience in our previous world, and with the opportunity that we had. So hopefully we'll share that with you and give you a little bit of insight. We've been in business for about 6 months, so it's still a relatively new company with obviously tremendous backing of talent and expertise, but also the intellectual capital that we've already developed and are ready to deliver. So we're delivering some work and already engaging customers, and hope to do that and accelerate that as 2020 progresses. I was just going to do an intro, turn it over to Josh, let Josh give you an insight into sort of the state of the industry and some of the experiences we had from the field, and then I'll try to fill in some of the gaps and come back and talk about controls and cyber insurance.
Hello, everybody. I can make sure I'm in the realm of the microphone. We got our own YouTube channel. We've been recording a lot of videos, so making sure we speak in the microphone is second nature now. So like Frank said, we do cybersecurity, and you guys are in the IoT world, and it's one of those aspects of cybersecurity that is both new, a little bit older, a little bit more established. ICS is also kind of in that realm. Yet it's some of these areas that are either catching up or having new technologies that are being invented, and that's really impacting the world. And so as things shift and cybersecurity sort of plays catch up, I mean, we all know IT security has been a thing for a long time. IoT and ICS and OT security is definitely behind the curve. But the problem is that that's going to be where the predators go next. And that's because there's a lot of opportunity there, there's a lot of impact there, and as they move towards the idea of impacting as many things as they can in order to extort those things for payment, that's where they're going to head. So I don't know how many of you have seen the Team 82 and Clarity report from 2022? Anybody? So Team 82 and Clarity work in the IoT cybersecurity space. They release a report every year about the number of vulnerabilities that are out there and all that sort of stuff. So this is actually from their 2022 report. And so in this report, you'll see that for the first half of the last half of 2021 and first half of 2022, there was a 60% increase in the number of IoT vulnerabilities that were disclosed. So as the number of those vulnerabilities go up, so does the attention that's paid to it. And so during the first half of 2022, there were 747 ex-IoT vulnerabilities that were published across 86 vendors in those industries. Now that's across IoT and OT, but still, those two are similar in a lot of ways. In a lot of ways, they actually blend. So when we talk about vulnerabilities and the vulnerability impacts, you'll see that the availability, reliability, and safety are the topmost concerns for extended IoT devices. Most of the top 10 vulnerabilities impacted or affected one of the top critical security areas, which you'll see on the thing are execution of unauthorized code commands, DOS crash, exit restart, bypass protection mechanisms, some of the things that IoT and IoTF and that sort of stuff needs to take into account whenever it's functioning. Those are sort of critical things. So the vulnerabilities are already targeting the areas that are most critical to IoT. And so we want to give you some examples of some stuff that we've seen in the industry. So in 2015, which was a while back now, but there was a 0-day vulnerabilities that were created by some security researchers, and they decided to do a bit of a test with Wired.com. They did a whole piece on this. They had one of their reporters come out and actually take a Jeep onto the highway going 70 miles an hour, and these two hackers that were sitting in their home several miles away were able to access that Jeep remotely. Using those 0-day vulnerabilities, they were able to affect climate control, windshield wipers, speed, engine, transmission, everything about the Jeep. They were actually able to slow the Jeep down and steer it off the road from their laptop sitting at home.
Sweet.
So, I mean, that's it just shows you, even back in 2015, how extensive IoT is impacting real world things. And so that example, if you fast forward now today with over-the-air updates and sort of the autonomous self-driving cars, you can see how this sort of stuff can become a much bigger deal. So in 2019, Nortec, they do door access control systems. And they had a vulnerability that came out, specifically CV 2019-7256. And that was actively being exploited in the wild across the internet, hundreds of thousands of devices being compromised, turned into botnets. Now, those botnets were primarily used to launch DDoS attacks across the world. But one of the things we know from being on the breach incident response side of things is that DDoS attacks oftentimes are used as an extraction mechanism to cover up additional compromises and attacks. So if you look at what this vulnerability was also capable of doing, remote control of the doors that they had access to, which means distributed from across the internet, you could essentially unlock doors and get access to unauthorized areas. They also provided the ability to move laterally into the networks that those door systems were connected into, which meant now they had a foothold into the rest of the network to be able to compromise any other system that might be connected on those networks. But there's another thing we know from being on the sort of incident response side of things is that there are way too many flat networks out there, no segmentation, no port control, no security controls. Perimeter defense was primarily the golden grail of security up until about 5 years ago when ransomware really kicked off. And then at that point, we started realizing that if you get past that perimeter,
Just a moment. You guys familiar with the term DOS or DDoS? What that means? Denial of service.
Yeah. Sorry. So which affects the availability, which again is a huge deal for IoT. Yes. In 2020 and 2021, Ring security camera, owned by Amazon at this point, they didn't actually have a breach of their services, but what they did have was a bunch of credential stuffing attacks come through. And what that is that when a user signs up for a service, they use their email address and create a password. If they reuse that password and that email address somewhere else that gets compromised, now their credentials are out there on the dark web for anyone. Well, if you know anything about the amount of credentials that are exposed, even this year, I think in Q1 it was upwards of 70 million credentials were dumped between the T-Mobile hack, the Twitter breach, and several others. I mean, and that's just already in this year. So the amount of credentials that are out there is insane. So if you want to go do credential stuffing attacks all day long, you can. So what these threat actors were doing is they were logging into the Ring camera system, which is cameras within people's homes. And 15 families had to file police reports because the threat actors were actually communicating to their children through the audio features of the cameras in the home. So I mean, it's a pretty terrifying thing to think about how the impact of these devices that we often take for granted or as a quick setup or an easy thing to do in the world turn into a real foothold and a vulnerability, not just for us, but for our families and real world consequences. And we also don't know how many were undisclosed. I mean, the 15 that were filed police reports is great, but how many were just sitting there silently watching these cameras in people's homes? So when we talk about OT versus IoT, this is an example of an actual compromise that I worked last year, 2022, and it was last year. So there was a glass manufacturer here local in the DFW area. They had a ransomware attack. And what happened was the threat actor, once they got into the environment, again, pre-flop network manufacturer, they took IP security fairly serious for their individual endpoints, but what they didn't factor in was that all of their OT and manufacturing equipment, which ran old versions of Windows XP and things like manufacturing floor, was also connected to that environment. So once the threat actors had an into the network, they very quickly found these systems running on the manufacturing floor. Well, the problem is that when you've got an OT system for manufacturing that's the primary money generator business, even if it's impacted by ransomware or malware, you can't take it down. because now it's impacting your business, impacting your production, impacting your ability to do your job. So not only did they know that there might be something going on in their network that might be weird, number one, they couldn't pinpoint it because they weren't looking at it. And two, when we did actually come in and help them, figure out the ransomware attack and where it came from, how it happened, the threat actors were able to maintain persistence in the network, even as they had tried to restore, because they were holding a connection to those OT systems that were on the network. And because they weren't being remediated, threat actors were able to reinfect after they had rebuilt. And that's when they get us a call.
What is OT?
OT is operational technology.
Oh, okay.
So OT and operational technology is, think about it, anything with industrial control systems, smart cities, building lighting, sometimes health preservation systems and hospitals and things like that. Emergency systems often operate energy, gas, sort of any sort of industrial system.
Gary, and XIoT means cyber.
And IoT is part of that. That XIoT thing is where OT also sits. And so it's considered devices that are traditionally outside of the standard IT security domain, but rapidly are becoming more connected in the world. It's leading to these sorts of problems. So once they have the ability to, actually disconnect those systems from the network, we're able to restore that company's environment and get them back up and running. When we left, they were still leaving the malware executing on that system. It just wasn't connected to the network anymore, which meant they were having to ferry. We did confirm the malware couldn't copy itself through USB, but they were having to ferry new plans back and forth between a clean computer and the infected computer because they couldn't actually do the internet anymore. And until they could have a maintenance window where they could take that down and actually reinstall it, which that was another issue because the version of everything it ran on wasn't being made anymore. So the only way to get a clean copy of that was to have the manufacturer basically upgrade their whole system, which is a huge cost in the manufacturing world. So a lot of times what we tell those companies is take a copy of your hard drive during a maintenance window before you have an attack. So if you ever have to restore, you can do that. But it's definitely a problem for OT. So how do we know this is getting worse? Every year I go to Vegas for an event called DEF CON. This last year was DEF CON's 30th anniversary. There were 25,000 attendees from all over the world, criminals of all sorts. It is the world's largest hacking convention. And they have a number of very specific villages: airplane hacking, car hacking, voting machine hacking, wireless hacking, all sorts of different areas where you can come in. One of the things that started up in the last 5 or 6 years was the IoT hacking. And what this is they bring in a bunch of IoT connected devices, everything from the medical industry to home appliances to kind of anything that has an IoT sort of string to it. They set them all up on a network in the environment. They let hackers connect and say, "Come on." So you've got active exploit development being created. You've got contests centered around all that sort of stuff. In fact, I actually participated in the biohacking village, which had a sort of a medical slant to sort of IoT. And one of the things that was mentioned in there was trying to devise a way to exfiltrate data out of a hospital using smart light switches. So what they would do is they would have a camera set up across the highway from a hospital focused on a particular window. And you're supposed to use the IoT smart lighting system to flip the lights on and off for 1 and 0 to exfiltrate data out of the environment across the street. So hackers are not only creative, they're actively doing this sort of strange intermix of reality in the digital world that is very hard to protect yourself from. And so when we talk about these smart sensors, some of the other things that we've seen is, smart sensors being used to alter diagnosis. There's a smart medical machine in my doctor's office that dispenses medication. I'm constantly terrified of what's going to happen when a threat actor is able to compromise that and can alter dosages. And this sort of stuff is happening. One of the coworkers that I had at my last place of employment came from the NSA, and he spent 7 years doing counterintelligence operations, basically hacking foreign governments. And some of the idea stuff that they were coming out with was, well, how do we, get rid of people, or how do we take people down, things like this, sort of war games, sort of prep house style stuff. Things they can't actually do because we're not at war and it would take us there, but things they have to be prepared for. And one of the things was figuring out ways to give people digital cancer by altering the medical diagnosis, by altering medical dosages, by doing things that would, impact them and potentially cause an actual life-threatening event. You think you're getting what you need from your doctor's relying on data and a database. That database has been altered unknowingly, and then suddenly you're taking taking medication for things that, if you don't have those symptoms, can cause serious problems. So these are real world things, and the IoT security is no joke. It's only becoming increasingly more connected, increasingly more complex, and increasingly more the central topic of threat actors out there in the world. That's why we have to take it seriously. So the Quality report, Team 82 report, had their mitigations for what they considered the top ways to sort of prevent IoT compromises. And so they started with their first one, which was network segmentation. Network segmentation can be a time-intensive thing and a manpower-intensive thing, but it doesn't always have to be an expensive thing. But it is one of the critical core security controls that if you build your network well using this, it does two things. Number one, it makes it much harder, not impossible, for a threat actor to necessarily navigate around your network and move laterally. So not only can it help prevent data compromise, breaches, and things like that, but it can also significantly reduce the scope of incident. So let's say you have multiple data repositories with different, protected data. You've got HR, you've got accounting, you've got all sorts of other stuff. If one area is compromised, it doesn't necessarily have to bleed over into your whole business is now being exposed. The next thing is identity access management. So privileged access, multi-factor authentication, anything where you can control who gets access to what, when, where. Now, there's a lot of systems, there's a lot that goes into this, everything from Active Directory and domain policy all the way down to when you enroll a new user and you assign them a new computer system and create them accounts and everything else. There are a lot of things in this area that start to get a bit expensive, but it's also one of those critical security control features that I think everybody needs to be aware of. And we talk about ransomware and phishing protection, which, if you're in the cyber insurance world, are the two biggest cost factors. IBM put out a report just earlier, just like later this last year, that said the average ransomware attack now is $4.3 million. And that's the average. Now, being from inside the insurance world, we've seen ransoms go as high as $20 million. And companies have paid it. And the cyber insurance companies have said, we are not paying for that. And though it has been a serious problem for businesses, it's also a huge problem for small and medium business. And even the financial crimes coming out of phishing, I mean, it's insane. I've seen a number of wire fraud transfers upwards of over $1 million being wired to the wrong bank account just because of a simple phishing attack, where someone convinced someone, didn't even have to compromise the account, but convinced someone in the accounting department that a wire transfer needed to go through to this account because they were the chief executive in charge, and they needed to make this today, and it had to be done. And because their processes and procedures and security wasn't up to stuff, there wasn't any checking, and the wire transfer went through. And if you don't catch a wire transfer fast enough, that money's as good as gone. And so I've seen businesses go out of business because of that. And that's another shocking statistic. A lot of small to medium businesses, around 60% of them cannot survive a ransomware or phishing attack. They will go out of business because of the financial and business impact. Especially with ransomware, when it shuts your whole office down, how long can your business really be out of business until there's no more funds to bring in with that? So when we talk about ransomware and phishing, we want to talk about email filtering, secure backups, endpoint threat detection, and active threat containment. Does anybody know what any of those things are? Doesn't know what those things are? If you've heard EDR, you've covered endpoint detection and monitoring. You've kind of got those last two. Active threat containment, the ability to detect malware as it's executing and shut it down. Endpoint threat detection, which is the ability to find behavioral things happening on the system that traditional antivirus might not see, and then be able to shut those actions down. Secure backup is these days not just having an offsite backup, it's actually having backups that are segregated from your domain, that are immutable, that are write once, read many times, and then having them where the credentials aren't in any way correlated to the rest of your domain, because if that gets compromised in a traditional ransomware attack, they will go after your backups. They will destroy that data because they want to basically pay the ransom for the encryption fee. And then email filtering for phishing is huge. And email filtering can entail a lot of things. One of the security controls that isn't really on there that probably should, we just did a video on how to set up SPF, DMARC, and DKIM, which are 3 security controls that are completely free that you can set up for your email domain that significantly help stop phishing. So you should check that out. But then also, rest of email filtering is the ability to detect malicious links, detect phishing attachments, analyze those things in real time as they come through the environment, and then kind of detonate them in a sandbox type environment to determine if they're malicious or good or bad, and then have that stuff get filtered out so their history users don't have to. Now, while these are clarities controls, the biggest one I think is missing from this is the one that I probably talk the most, and it's security culture. We talk a lot about, everyone has the education piece. Everyone has to go sit through how not to get phished sort of training every year. It's becoming increasingly mandatory with all of the government regulation and everything that continues to come, the new data privacy laws, all that sort of stuff. But one of the things we aren't doing a good enough job of is security culture. Increasing the general awareness with everyone in the company, everyone, even people at home, especially in today's remote workforce area. The ability to know what is out there and what you're susceptible to is pretty critical. And so I think that's probably something that should be updated.
And there's a lot of cases out there, people go through training and then they'll send out, week, 2, 3 weeks later, they'll send out a fake phishing email and 30 or 40% of the employees will click on it.
Exactly.
So it seems like a hell of a battle to try to win.
It really is, but it does start with hearts and minds. It was funny. I was talking with another sort of a CISO at an event we were at, and they said what they did for their company, as weirdly as it might sound, they had a phishing mascot, someone who dressed up in a costume that was essentially the phishing mascot, who would come to the office and parade around the office and sort of generally be there to throw out flyers on phishing and that sort of stuff. They saw a 15% decrease in phishing over the life of that mascot coming into the office, which is a significant jump. And what that really drives to is that education and awareness doesn't have to take the form of I'm sitting through this mandatory training and I'm clicking through screens and I'm not paying attention to what I'm reading. It needs to be a conversation. It needs to be something you're talking about the water cooler. It needs to be something that's brought into the company. It's integrated into the environment, something that keeps people entertained, keeps them engaged, and that they can actually take something away from that. It doesn't have to all be at once, but it's something you want to be able to incrementally do over time, because cybersecurity is also not a 0 to 100 jump. It is a constant upward hill battle from less secure to more secure. And as the technology changes, environment changes, the landscape shifts, that will never stop. You always have to be making strides to be more secure. Now, for when something does go wrong, you've got to consider your cyber insurance stuff. And so that's where I'll start over Frank.
I just realized as I was standing up talking about cyber insurance that you may think that I'm a cyber insurance broker or salesman or something like that, which would be perfectly fine, but I just wanted to make that disclaimer right off the bat. We don't sell cyber insurance, we're not cyber insurance brokers. We know a lot about the topic, spent a significant amount of time in our career in that field. But before I talk about cyber insurance, I wanted to call out a couple things that you saw in a previous chart. Josh was talking about security controls. And we use this term pretty loosely, but security control is essentially something that exists in the environment that prevents a threat from being passed from the point, right? And as we talk about security controls, I'm sure you're familiar with the standards, the NIST, the IUCs, the ETSI, a variety of different standards that have been released, all of which are really frameworks that present a collection of controls that they recommend, right? And so there are many flavors of those. There are many flavors of the ice cream, as we say. There's really not one better than the other. What's important is how they're tailored, how they're implemented, and how they're executed once you have them in place. So cyber insurance. We see cyber insurance as an extension of those security controls, right? So if you think about cyber insurance, or any insurance for that matter, it would be a shift in risk, right? You are moving risk from one bucket to the other. And you're making a financial trade, essentially, paying a price for someone else to absorb that risk. And that, when it's done in a very informed environment, is incredibly powerful. It's an incredibly powerful risk management tool. Unfortunately, and this is what we wanted to highlight in this session, is in the world of IoT, in the world of ICS, and special systems, OT, sort of non-IT stuff, it's a huge blind spot. It's a blind spot because it hasn't been examined enough, it hasn't been investigated enough, it really hasn't been paid attention enough to assess the risk accurately, and then properly implement those people. So what you'll see is cyber insurance has evolved tremendously over the last 10 years in how it understands IT security, IT risk. It really hasn't done a good job when it comes to operational technology. Most insurance, and when we talk to insurance brokers or insurance carriers,
will be questioning it, right? So they'll give you a piece of paper, fill out questions, yes or no, do you have this, not have that, water and gas controls or controls are in place. When they get to the operational technology IoT section, do you have them? Are there air gaps? You get more questions than that, and you deal with a really advanced cyber insurance program. The way that those policies are usually managed, when you talk to IT security companies, there are some very, very developed, very advanced cyber insurance carriers out there that will actually monitor and spend time with you during the lifetime of the policy. In other words, they don't just sell you a piece of paper and wait for you to call them a claim. They actually spend time with you during the lifetime of the policy to help you manage that risk, give you some advisories, maybe provide some scanning and monitoring along the way. All in good spirit. When it comes to IT, works fantastically well. When it comes to non-IT, very, very little. I'd be surprised to see if you see one or two advisors non-IT security risk. And so really, you get to this point of a binary, is it there, is it not there? And that's the lowest level of risk assessment that we see. So something to be very mindful of, very cognizant of, especially if you're looking for a cyber policy to mitigate some significant risks from the environment. Talk about standards, and this is sort of the irony of our industry. A lot of these standards have been around for a very long time, since we were all sort of high school, many of them, right? And that's the amazing thing is the standards have evolved, they're versioning, they're improving, and they're getting better. Unfortunately, I'll say this in the context of different geographies. Unfortunately, in the United States, a lot of these standards are not enforced. They're sort of prescriptive as advice and advisory. They're never really punitive. They're never measured or sort of punished for the non-compliance. They're guidelines. They're really not prescriptive. And I think that's a huge miss. And I think you'll see that improve over the course of the next couple of years based on the type of focus we have in administration. But when you look in other parts of the world, across Europe, right, with even the early standards when it came to ISO and basic safety and implementation standards, very strictly enforced, very strictly adhered to. Any sort of market access required those standards to be in place. When GDPR came into effect, everyone was scratching their head going, penalties. Sure enough, within 6 months, you saw multi-million-dollar, multi-million pound and euro type penalties, and you saw that serious approach to not following those standards. So I wanted to call out a couple that are relevant to us and relevant to our world. How many of you are familiar with the NIST in general? NIST standards, right? National Institute of Standards, right? 8259? Yes, no? A little bit? Okay, so 8259 is an interesting standard because it allows IoT devices to follow a certain protocol for both manufacturing and also consumption on the consumer side. It's a real nice framework. It's not necessarily a mandatory, but it's a framework just like all the other NIST frameworks that you can follow and get a really clear view of what the manufacturing process should look like, what the deployment should look like. On the federal requirement side, common criteria, is that a term familiar with you guys? Yeah? Yes or no? Not really. So common criteria is actually ISO standard, and it was implemented as a prerequisite to sell, to deploy, to deliver devices to the federal government. Right? So before the federal government accepts them, there's a certain requirement to review the encryption algorithms that are in place, the security algorithms that are in place, essentially ensuring that those devices haven't been tampered with and they follow a certain standard before the federal government will require it. So your traditional vendors, your Cisco's, your Firewall, your FireEye, your Cisco's, any sort of network equipment manufacturers, device manufacturers, they don't have to do common criteria certification. FIPS 140, yes, oh yeah. You have some scars with FIPS, right? Similar, right? Similar. A very, very prescriptive cryptographic standard on how data must be processed, how it must be transmitted, how it must be stored. Again, before you're allowed to deliver those devices to the federal government. Those are great. Not as common in the non-government application, unfortunately. The last two I really wanted to call to your attention. So the ISO standard 62443. Yes, maybe? No? So 62443 refers to More industrial control systems, so it's devices that are applied or that are functioning in a controlled environment. And it's the entire control systems environment. So this is a standard that lets you implement security standards across the entire control system. Control system all the way down to the devices, the networking, the integration of the network, and ultimately a full scope evaluation. Non-mandatory yet. I'll just leave it at that because I'm speculating. But the next one, ETSI. ETSI EN 3034645. These are kind of widely considered. Remember, 2701 was so great. Everyone could remember that one. But the ETSI standard is actually very interesting because this one's been around as a European standard from EU. And it was used as a market entry standard for cybersecurity of IoT devices. So if you manufacture a device somewhere else and you wanted to bring it to market, to the European market, it was mandatory. It had to be certified by an independent third party to fulfill a certain set of requirements. Actually, I'll have another chart on this one to go a little bit deeper. Really interesting is this particular standard is now being adopted in the US as well. So by January 2024, so by next January, all IoT devices manufactured in the US need that's awesome. Yeah, absolutely.
You're talking about the IEC one?
Yep, ETSI 30346, 645.
That's for all current products.
All current products. And a lot of manufacturers are already going through cycles of the independent reviews, and it's actually one of the two that we're also very focused on. So let me maybe share another chart, and this will be one maybe worth taking a picture of even, because this is a breakdown of the ETSI standard. So it has 13 security controls as a prescription. These are the 13 security controls that must be implemented in your product.
Are you using consumer in the way that we normally think of it as consumer, or, like buying a smart device for my house, or does this extend beyond that to building monitoring or something? Is this truly consumer?
This is truly consumer and consumer. Yeah, this is a safety protocol for the consumer to be protected. And the way it works is it has explicit 13 security controls. I think it has 2 more related to data privacy, but just to zero in on these 13, they're not owners. These are not, these will not make you stay up at night. The problem is they aren't usually implemented by the manufacturers. They aren't fully implemented, and certainly they're not. They're tested to by third parties to make sure that they have them implemented correctly. So what this ETSI standard prescribes is for the manufacturer to not only attest that they have implemented these, but to show a protocol how they have been implemented. They hand it over to an independent third party like us to verify that yes, in fact, each one of these security controls has been implemented to their specification, and if so, then they're certified. And
You said that's for US made?
this will be for US made international,
So-
for the US market. Yeah, our
So if I'm gonna buy a Chinese device,
in the US, unless you're buying on Alibaba and somehow makes it sort of customs. Yeah. Buy a legitimate device in the US market, it's going to fall with
even
to others.
manufacturing of
Yeah, and so in a way it's reassuring. In a way it's also a little bit daunting because we've never had this level of enforcement, this level of attention. But I think this is just, I think what we're seeing from CISA, from other government organizations, is such a tremendous step up in terms of taking the issue seriously, understanding the completeness of the data protection and security controls, and really giving us the prescription to follow. That is a little bit more enforced than the past. So we talk about security controls, and this is a little bit of a blurb. I think we're going to talk about building security, but really our goal, our objective, just to again reinforce that reset. Our objective is to prevent breaching. Let's talk about what happens after we've got before, but really our objective in business is to prevent them. And the only way we know how is to implement some preventative controls. So we talked about a lot of security controls. So I want to give you a little bit of a more of a visual of how we represent this and what we're building as a platform to
keep track of this. And if you follow the chart from left hand to the right, from left to right, we see an environment, whether it's a single device, whether it's a network, whether it's an entire enterprise, we see that as an attack surface. And across that attack surface, we know we can extract vulnerabilities. Everyone does, right? We do vulnerability scans all day long. We get 20,000 of them. We don't know where to get started. So what we do is we look at vulnerabilities in the package of the attack. And we want to look at vulnerabilities that are exploitable. So we can start to correlate to what types of attacks a particular device or particular network enterprise is susceptible to make sense of really what is the risk. Because we know that if an attack is ransomware, we know exactly what that looks like. We know exactly what it costs. We put some statistics for each industry. We know if it's data exfiltration. We know what that costs. We know what that looks like. So we correlate those exploitable attack vectors into threats to understand really what is a threat. Then we can align the security controls that we know prevent those threats. Josh gave you an idea or example of how some of the controls were aligned to prevent specific threats in an IoT environment. It applies to all other types of environment, right? So if you have a certain type of attack, remember there are certain set of controls that prevent that type of attack. Not 100%, there's nothing is, but it is very effective. And so our intent is to show a very transparent view of attack vector correlated to threats that you're susceptible to specific security controls, and then let our clients that are constituents decide based on the impact and likelihood in their industry, their environment, how to prioritize and implement the things that they can actually afford to make measurable progress. I'll piggyback on another point that Josh made, incrementally over time. Focus on the things that make the most impact and gradually improve over time and get better and better. And we believe that's very, very possible. So we group our approach into 3 buckets. Very, very simple. I think we can call it radically simple. I mean, it's radical, but it's definitely simple. And that is, there are certain things you need to prepare, there are certain things to prevent, and there are certain things you need to cover that will stay on top of some of these issues. And I won't go into the details, it's self-explanatory. We do have, however, a 24/7 hotline. If there's ever anything that happens, you call that number, someone's going to pick it up, someone's going to respond to it, and we go to work. And we go to work whether it's containment, investigation, whether it's a recovery, whatever that is. But we have to go to respond to bad news. So the way we organize this, and I don't, the way we organize this, and I know Josh already covered some, so maybe I'll be a little bit more focused and point out the couple that really make a huge difference. Preparing for bad things to happen cannot happen without a plan. Okay? Cannot happen without a plan. If you don't plan for bad event, there's no worse outcome, right? So the incident response plan is one of the first things we ask our clients. Can you please tell us if you have an incident response plan? Anything. What will you do if something bad happens? Who do you call? Who do you engage? Who's there? Who's not there? Depending on maybe severity. And is that team lined up? And is that team ready, rehearsed, able to execute on that plan? I think the others we've covered. The preventative controls, the ones that make sort of thresholds for cyber insurance, just to connect the dots. All of these are the security controls that across the cyber industry that we prescribe. We didn't pull these out of thin air. We didn't make them up. We literally are following exactly the common denominator of a variety of leading cyber insurance carriers of how they categorize risk, where they place this. The preventive controls, the ones that are mandatory by most carriers, multi-factor authentication, secure backup, and endpoint threat protection. Right? I think both factors we talked about fairly straightforward. One of the important control points in MFA is whether that second factor is phishable or not. Right? You've heard of attacks where they not only try to log into your account, but they also try to phish your second factor and either impersonate your phone or impersonate your device or somehow capture that second factor. So the important add-on for multi-factor is non-phishable. some sort of token, some sort of hardware token, perhaps a application app that runs on the phone. Secure backup, Josh already talked about. Endpoint threat detection, I would just add on endpoint threat detection, especially in IoT sort of device environment. We're very good at endpoint threat detection in an IT environment. We can all deploy a bunch of agents across our workstations or back what our workstation is doing, maybe even impose some policies and controls onto that workstation. What we're not very good at is doing the same thing in with every device running different operating system, different firmware, different versions, different networks, different protocols. However, Clarity was one great example. So the Clarity report that Josh was referencing earlier, Clarity is one of the vendors that has a platform that essentially listens to the exchange of communication on a non-IT network, establishes a certain baseline of what is okay, and when there's any sort of spike of anomaly in that communication, it correlates that back to IT security controls. And it says, there's something funky happening on your non-IT environment. Can you tell us, based on what you see in the IT environment, that there is really something bad happening, or should we support? So those types of monitoring environments are already available. They integrate very well with security operation centers, with SIEMs, it's the security event management type platforms. So you can pull all that information together and have truly an endpoint threat detection service, even in non-IT. So very, very important. And there's one thing I wanted to point out on the recovery side. When it comes to incidents, and you already heard Josh talk about, I mean, this was a big part of our life in the last few years in the previous company, when we've investigated many incidents. So we were in a firefighting mode nonstop. What you find, especially in the context of cyber insurance, is as soon as something bad happens and it's covered by policy, the cyber insurer steps in. They're there to help. They're there to help, to coordinate, to facilitate, bring in resources. It's, you know, unless you've gone through one of these, you don't realize just how much value you're getting in that firefight. So it's not just a matter of, great, you had an incident, tell us how big of a check we have to write to clean up the mess. No, you probably get someone to coordinate it. You probably get someone from legal to help manage their legal process. You probably get someone from notification to figure out whose data was breached and who will be notified. Obviously, you'll get a forensic investigation company like ours who helps you actually figure out what the root cause, what happened, how to prevent it from happening. And you'll probably get some help to recover your environment, recover back to what it was before. And that's huge as well, but just to honor the legs to go and do rebuild networks. So when it comes to the value, it's not just on the front end and the questions and the probing and the scans and all those things that may seem so uncomfortable at the time you're applying for one or renewing one. On the back end, when an event happens, it's a godsend. I mean, it's a time when you say, thank you, my lucky stars. I have my team in my corner to help me through this. Because if you don't, and you don't have an incident response plan, you literally strangle. And we've seen this the worst outcomes when it comes to not being prepared for an incident. One more point on a breach coach, and this may be a little bit funky term. It's something that was introduced into the industry a few years back, but it's literally someone who helps to coordinate instead of coach with you through an incident. Oftentimes, this is someone from the legal team. So it's a counsel, legal counsel, privacy counsel, someone very knowledgeable and experienced in sort of handling data breaches. What's also very important with that is sort of the legal implication of the breach. Right? We haven't talked about that yet, which is your network is breached, your environment is breached, your device is breached, your customer data is all over the place. How are you legally protected? Goes to regulatory fines, all kinds of industry, all kinds of class action lawsuits from customers and from vendors and others. Right, so all of that becomes sort of a legal liability on top of all the mess you have to deal with. What that breach coach can really help with is, first of all, bring the entire investigation under privilege, right? So a privilege discussion, privilege discovery, and protect and support you from all those various exposures, and make sure that the cleanup is done properly, the notification is done properly, and your business can survive a significant. So actually, the folks that we partner with have already embedded their privileged engagement model into our services. So if you happen to need, any sort of service that results in a breach, the legal counsel will be just automatically. And the industry standards, and I'll just kind of circle back to this because I'm a huge fan. And maybe this is good. I spent a few years in Europe in the cybersecurity world. And I just saw the positive impact, especially during GDPR. So as GDPR took hold and became more accepted, I saw just how much of a difference it made in preparedness of the industry. So I'm a big fan of not just GDPR, but industry standards in general. I think they're very, very helpful, very, very prescriptive. And so give us something to start from. Not to say that that's the end of the world, but it's something to start from that is already solid. And then it's really a question of adoption, a baseline of where I'm at, and then a plan to where I want to be. And it's definitely something that can be. A little bit of marketing. Are we out of time? Almost. So the things we do a little bit differently. First of all, education. We talked about this outside already. We're huge advocates of just general education, awareness, and spreading the word of what is risk, to mitigate it, and how it will ultimately work on the bad things that we've seen. It's not to scare folks. It's not to create FUD. It's really to create a path to knowledge. Once you're armed with knowledge, I think you're much better prepared for much better outcomes. You'll see we have a pretty substantial YouTube channel with a whole bunch of videos on just about any topic. Imagine explanation of every security control there is in the world, explanation of all the various threats, some specialized topics of some of the breaches that we've encountered. We just started some topics on cyber insurance and what is it and how to get it and what to pay attention to. We'll just continue to grow that, and it's on YouTube. It's not behind the paywall or anything like that.
So you just find it under Blue.
Exactly. If you search Blue Security, you'll find our channel. Excuse me. I didn't talk much about this yet, which is our certification. So when you think of a security control, right? Like MFA. MFA is a good example. Multi-factor authentication. Of course, we need MFA. But then, right, the next question is, well, to what extent? And to what extent is really a question of control points that need to be implemented within that security control. Is it physical? Is it not? Is it token? Is it not? Is it on every system? Is it on every service account? So on and so forth. There's not 13 or 14 control points within each of the security controls that we implement. And so what we do to make it very, very transparent, no smoke and mirrors. It's black and white, transparent, exactly what security control is implemented, exactly what security control points have been implemented, and we certify that back to the carrier and say, this particular client went through the lengths of implementing all these controls and all the control points, and we attest to that as an independent third party. We'll do that if we do the work. We also do that if we don't do the work. So if you do it yourself or you have someone else do it and say, hey, I want you to build me certificates out, take it back from my carrier, we'll do that. And there's, it's one of those, you can only go so far in a questionnaire or in a bit of a conversation, but when you have it explicitly stated what is there and what isn't, there's no debate. Okay. And finally, this is really around our mission, but call us melancholic or romantic or whatever. I mean, we care about what we do. I mean, we didn't build this to flip it. We didn't build this to get rich quick. We want to do this because we believe in our ability to influence where the industry is going and do some good and make a positive impact and do it with integrity, do it with understanding the necessity of this because this isn't a choice. This is a must. This has to be done, and ultimately do it with some real knowledge and real experience. And so anyway, I just wanted to add that so you know where we're coming from. And then our contact, I think someone asked, we do have a sort of a camp in Frisco. Obviously, we're here in GFL, we're available anytime. Our 24/7 hotline, our sales link, or our sales email, but of course, our personal emails will be also available. I brought a stack of just one-pagers, just one-page overview of what we do, all the security controls with our contact information. Feel free to grab one. I brought a bunch of pens. Of course, they're blue.
Of course.
And a few business cards as well, so you have the but thank you so very much. Again, we appreciate tremendously, not just that you came, but just the opportunity to present
very gracious, and we hope to contribute and be a good steward of what we heard.
Great. All right, we'll get back to- Do you guys have any questions at all? Yeah, go ahead, Thomas.
So I hear on insurance for the two sides of this, but I've heard a guy when they get very clearly articulate why you should not spend money on insurance. Because you'll spend more money on your cybersecurity to prevent. You guys are on the side, so what do you think about that? I don't.
No, that's a great question because it's a balance, right? And the balance is the insurance is going to catch you when you fall.
Yeah.
But it's not going to prevent you from falling. Not for the most part, right? There's some very innovative products out there, but for the most part, you buy insurance because you know there are certain things you just can't do. So what we're advocating is do what you can. Do what you can, because at the end of the day, there's no shortcut, right? Do what you can afford, what you can get the most return on. For everything else, let's get insurance. Just chances are you'll need, right? And when you do, you'll be thankful because of the things that you've done as preventive controls. The extent of the bad things that happen will be very, very limited. Just like network segmentation, you're limited to just one segment of your network, one subset of data. Maybe it's MFA that kept you from fully having your entire domain and all the accounts compromised, and it's just one account too. So these are preventive things that you can't afford. And that's the other side of it. I probably should have spent more time on this, which is the cost of all this, right? We know cybersecurity industry is notorious for being extremely expensive, extremely difficult. This is the the 10,000-pound gorilla, whatever in the world right now. But we believe, and you haven't heard us mention one product, right? So if we can do things native, we do them native. We do use Office 365 that you have, use your Google Cloud service that you have, or the existing network infrastructure that you have. Where we can use the things you have, we want to. This is not about selling something that new to the environment that will solve world hunger. It's really about implementing the control that you have correctly for the maximum benefit and the good insurance for everything. And hopefully it does happen.
Just drawing a analogy, just like with home insurance, if you have an alarm system, you get a 10% discount or whatever. I know nothing about cyber insurance, so if you go through these various measures, do those cyber insurance companies then give the end customer a discount, so to speak?
Yeah,
How does that work?
yeah, great question. Great question. So it doesn't necessarily always translate into discount. I'll describe sort of the tiers. The first tier is you may not be able to qualify for security. You may show up for 6, 7, 8, 10 carriers, or your broker will shop and come back and say, you're just not going to cover. You don't have to do it. There's a certain threshold to just be able to get cyber insurance. In fact, the whole uninsurable thing is one of the things we're trying to solve is we'll just do the minimum just to get you a point of view insurable. But then you're absolutely right. The more mature your security controls are, and demonstrate, which is how we're using our certificates, we want to get a little bit more formal for you to be able to put the stack of paper back to the carrier and say, look, really, these things are tip-top. It doesn't get better. That then obviously translates into better terms, more flexible terms, things that retention, better premiums. The thing is, premium, depending on, of course, the size of the organization and history of breaches, premium usually isn't astronomical. So we're not talking about saving hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's pretty, because it's not that expensive. Again, look, yes, it's increasing. Yes, it's an extra expense. I fully appreciate that. But it's not that you'll make it go away completely. You'll probably get much better returns. Probably would have.
It's probably worth noting that the insurance industry as a whole right now is going through a technological renaissance in and of itself. Many of the carriers and some of these new insurtechs, which are newer NGAs, things that have come up, are doing things like actively scanning or grabbing passively scanned information about your environment and your network already. They're already rating you in the back end of things. They can't directly come in and tell you you have to have these security controls and local insurance. What they will do is they'll use their questionnaires, they'll use the information they can gather out there on the internet, and they'll make broad, sometimes not accurate assumptions about your environment and how secure you are, and they'll rate you. And the way it was boiled down to that I've seen is it's essentially red, yellow, green. Red is don't touch it, don't fit the fold. Yellow is like, yeah, but like, maybe jack up the premium or give them, we don't cover this or we don't cover that. They'll do specific carve outs. Or green that, we think they're a decent enough risk that we can go ahead and insure. So it's, the insurance carriers are getting smarter about how to understand that risk, and it's directly in correlation to the amount of ransomware attacks that occurred over the last 5 years. There was a huge spike in them when COVID hit, and everyone went remote. No one was prepared from a security standpoint because everyone's focused on perimeter defense. Well, suddenly your perimeter isn't your perimeter is the internet. You've got everyone sitting at home trying to connect it with a VPN, and you've got to start enabling RDP and all sorts of things, and you get your business up and running, which the business wants to facilitate. A lot of bad and poor security choices were made in order to give people quick access to do their job, that ultimately resulted in a slew of ransomware attacks. And so, because of that, the insurance industry paid out on all these things. Basically went, well, we can't have this, we got to figure this out. So a lot of them either went out and bought cybersecurity companies, or as we experienced, built their own, and then basically decided to, get smarter on how to, mitigate that by understanding what your environment is, what it looks like, what risk. The problem is there's still a big disconnect between every environment that could potentially be out there and what the insurance company actually truly understands, because at the end of the day, it isn't really their industry. They are in the insurance industry, they're underwriters, they know how to do their job. And they're basically being asked to learn a very deep and wide another career in cyber to really truly understand the risk. And so that's what we hope to be able to facilitate, that is to be able to bridge that communication gap, that understanding gap, to say the insurance companies don't fully understand this. Cyber insurance world or cybersecurity world does, but the two aren't speaking the same language. We have a lot of unique background and experience that lets us to make those connections and sort of solidify that stuff. And that's where a lot of this is coming from. So just be aware that when you do go out to get insurance, you shouldn't be surprised if they come back and it seems like they might already have a scan of you, and they might already say you're exposed to these things, because they are doing it.
And just one quick follow-up to that is, it sounds like you guys are focused on best practices first. You guys do that, you're whatever. So I think that's what I heard you saying, like 365 and blah, 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 right? And so I guess you're trying to coach your customers into getting that squared away, and then perhaps the insurance part kind of follows along with it. Maybe at some point you're tolerant to play because you've got all the best practices, right? And then you move on from there. So
Yeah.
what do you think?
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think that's fair. And when you say best practices, it's a fairly low bar to jump over, to hop over. So we're not advocating people to go out and become cybersecurity experts, but get over a certain bar.
Yeah, keep yourself up to date, keep firmware up to date, all that kind of stuff.
Do the basics, and the basics will cover a significant amount of those, and then figure out how to prioritize the rest of it. That was, part of our platform, part of the discussion. What we're headed is we want to be able to show you a clarifying view, so that you don't have to scratch and go, oh my God, how do I implement this thing or that thing? Just here's the 3, 4, 5 things you can do in this quarter. By the way, whether you get them from us or anybody else doesn't matter. Still happy to certify those conditions. We can support you through the insurance process. And this is effective costs. And weigh those things against, well, I'm going to buy insurance anyway. Maybe I'm just going to do this first year. That's what I can afford. I need those people. And then maybe next year I'll get back to really quick. And so,
And you may have heard that it's not a matter of if, but when. And I hate saying that because it's become cliche, and it really does paint the wrong message in terms of, how to prepare for cybersecurity. You can only fearmonger so long until people just tune you out. But the truth is that, you see it all the time. and we're on the other side of that fight, those fires all the time. And you see just how easy it would have been if you had just done this one thing. It couldn't have happened, or if it had happened, it wouldn't be anywhere near this bad. That's It's really why we see all of this kind of tying it together. It's why the insurance is, we see it more as a security control than as just something to either pack onto the back of the recovery or risk or not. It's the piece of the puzzle. It's like having an incident response plan. It's like having a disaster recovery plan. Like you should have those things as a piece of the puzzle that you use to mitigate this stuff, and then the cyber insurance and stuff.
Good question. So what's the kind of the profile and roles of people like yourself? Who's interested in this? Who's got the great question. So first let's talk about size, right? Because I think size is very important. The different client that we work with anywhere from 50 to a couple thousand, 2,000 employees. The reason for that is you reach a point where organizations and departments will help their own capabilities. They're really not looking to help to implement the controls, but rather just looking for local reach. We're happy to help. We don't engage. Once you get below 50, maybe 30, maybe 20 employees, you're dealing with organizations that just simply don't have the attention span. Not the willingness, but the attention to really pay to the important steps. And we wish they did, because they're small doctor's offices, they're small dentist offices, small law firms, small accounting firms. But all of them have a tremendous amount of customer data, a whole lot of PIIs and PHI and cost. It's very expensive. But we try to sort of stay in that small and medium space in terms of size, in terms of industry. It's industries that are most acceptable and appreciate cyber threat, which are financial services, healthcare, and to some extent education. And I hate throw education in there because higher ed, you see some of the most devastating stuff. And the reality is widespread. The ransom with status in the financial services, they're devastating. They'll bring the school down, and they're just months and months and months.
Or worse, networks in schools. We had one incident that we did where there were, I think there were 6 or 7 schools that were affected because they were all tied together as part of one school district network. And when they took the whole thing down, every one of those schools, which was, I guess, about 15, 20 miles, just was unable to function. I mean, it was really bad.
And I mean, the way you see it is, is the pain worth paying? Things like ransom or demand or extortion, right? Is there enough pain in the business to extort? Because if there is, then we're back to a property. And so you give manufacturing where you can impact supply chain and manufacturing lines of the business. That is very extortive. You don't have to strip data. You don't have to maybe even before ransomware homes, you can bring the network down. There's not a service, distribute no service. Very effective. E-commerce. Right? E-commerce, unfortunately, as soon as any sort of e-commerce presence goes down, business stops. Register stops rating. And I think the others are still going through financial services, of course, medicine, trade, and down. That's the first portion of healthcare. And that's the sad part. We've seen, you'll read the news and see the articles of these sort of hackers with powers. They have biggest funding. Well, we don't have the healthcare, we don't have hospitals. But from the other side, when you see a range of IP addresses, and you just do a enumerate domain, you don't know. What happens is they bring them down, and once they're down, they'll issue the decryption key of apologies. They don't pay the ransom for the decryption key. Some. And even when they do that, you already have all your systems done. You already have to rebuild all your systems. You have to do the investigation. You have to be able to pick up. You have to be able to deal with the lawyers. Right? It's half the point of return. So any which way you consider carbon, there's money to be made for the back end.
That's an administrative workload. And then for those that are truly on the smaller side that really can't pay attention to focus on stuff, what we really hope our education initiative will do through it and things like that, we're putting out how to go to the free control yourself. You may not be able to pay somebody to do it, but maybe you can take 15 or 20 minutes, watch a YouTube video, do this yourself, walk through the process, set it up, get it working. In fact, we're involved with a number of, or at least one small business organization, nonprofit that helps small businesses and entrepreneurs get off the ground in order to kind of do this just pure education issue. Where we do presentations and we talk them through what to do when you're a small business and maybe you operate just out of a Gmail account. What do you do? How do you secure yourself so that way that one asset, that one thing that's so critical for your business isn't compromised or isn't at risk? And we hope that's where the education initiative can do. Because if you can't afford it, then we'll at least try to educate you, maybe do something like that.
Okay. Yeah, so in the consumer product space, we're on extremely tight deadlines. We're talking like 8 months, 12 months, 16 months, we're lucky. To change that roadmap at all, implement some of the stuff to the standard that we talked about beforehand, you're really gonna have to twist the arms of these companies. And so do you know if the enforcement of the standard is going to be an incremental approach? Because I know we talked about this in terms of what you're offering this. Or is this going to be like, here it is, we're enforcing this, and there's going to be a big shock for those companies?
Yeah, there's the traditional mode of enforcement of standards in the United States has been a release of mandatory deadlines and then also a release of enforcement deadlines. We haven't seen the enforcement deadlines yet, but we've seen the deadlines of implementation and requirements in place. Much like with CCPA, you had a sort of a law went into effect and enforcement later. I think you'll see the same approach with the industry standards. We haven't talked about data privacy. There's a whole other category of protecting data, sensitive data. In the United States, currently the mode has been at a state level, right? So you have California protection law, you have Virginia, you have Colorado, obviously state of New York, and now you have, I think, 4 or 5 states coming online as well. Massachusetts was one of them. I should know all of them. But anyway, my point is, you will see states very quickly releasing their data protection standard, which will become the privacy standard for storing and protecting sensitive information. But that will become essentially is a data discovery, data classification, data protection exercise for privacy firms. We partner with someone who helps to implement those privacy programs, and then of course we have that income to control protection.
Yeah, great follow-up. So my company's in a little bit of a gray area when it comes to stuff like that. So we do IoT for marketing and advertising initiatives. So we're talking like I'll give an example. Whenever we were working with Miller Lite, we did like IoT rings, like you get all your friends together, you put it over your phone, you have free beers in your house, right? It's technically a consumer product, but it's not at the same time. Do you know what the enforcement standard for stuff like that would be?
I would speculate. I think that's a good question for privacy counsel. Happy if you want to grab a card, I'll have to get you in touch with one that we work with, and it's an interesting one to figure out, not only just for compliance, but I think also there's this other side of all this, which is you want your customers to know. You want your customers to know how seriously you take this stuff and project an image of a responsible organization, responsible with their data, responsible with their information. And I think that is a competitive advantage. It should be, right? That is something that companies should embrace as an advantage rather than a punitive, I don't do it for this and that. You'll see us in general, the industry, on all the certifications, I'm certified with that. Just the credibility. If you translate that into the ethical approach of the profession and how you treat data, how you treat customers, I think that's powerful.
Thank you.
So much.
Just to tack onto that, I think what you'll see is that, like a lot of things in the cybersecurity world, it'll be there and it'll be sort of lackadaisically, sort of adhered to until there's a problem. And the more press coverage and the more incidents that occur and the more things that are targeted in the IoT world, the ICS world, the IoT world, or OT world, the more press coverage that's out there, the more it becomes, we got to fix this. It's the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? So I think as these things come out, the companies that find a way to make it work at the beginning, to kind of build their processes and their companies around as painful as it be, will be much better off in the long run when it does come up.